You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, hey folks, it's Wednesday evening. Welcome. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, just like every other night of the week. 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Left Coast Time, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com if you want to hear the audio and listen to, and go find out where else we broadcast, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, other places like that, as well as the terrestrial stations represented by Odyssey Radio Network. And you can also come over and view the video broadcast, the simulcast, right over on my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And I think one of the benefits, you could listen to the audio over on Odyssey1.com, and you can come over and tune into the YouTube channel, and you can see the live chat that goes on with our listeners right here during the show. So welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. Thanks for being here. It's a nice, crisp autumn day. One of the sad things I'm hearing, though, is they're predicting the possibility of a little snow up here already in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I got to tell you, we've had some early winters. We've had some Halloween blizzards in the past. But this early winter stuff is for the birds. I don't mind it. If it comes, maybe give us a little dusting, whatever. But once that starts coming, you're pretty much destined for 4 hard months of winter, pushing 5 perhaps. It usually starts, what's the old song from the old Lerner and Loewe musical, Camelot, where they sing about Camelot itself, and he says, the winter is forbidden till December, and exits March the 2nd on the dot. If that's the way it was around here, I think I'd be happy with it. But March the 2nd hits, and you've usually had a little February thaw. March the 2nd, you know you've got about a month left of winter and possibly a couple of blizzards to go through. But the nice thing is in that part of the year it starts to thaw quick. But now, what am I talking about spring for and spring thaws? We're just going to start going into the winter months. So I don't know what part of the country or the world you are in and what your winters are like. But if you hear of bad and harsh winters in the northeast of the United States, Minnesota, Wisconsin has a bad rep for being a frozen tundra up here. And it's really not. It's gorgeous. Hot and humid in the hundreds up in the summertime. You could be subtropical up here if it weren't for the fact that we go into winter half of the year. So now we're at October. It's early for cold weather for me, and I'm not a big fan of it getting too cold too early. I hate hot and humid. That's why I don't live in the South or the Southeast. I like the transitional seasons up here. I like cooler weather. I like sweater weather. That's the kind of thing, because then, you're working outside. You can take the sweater off or the jacket and roll up your sleeves and be burly and sweaty in the 50 to 60 degrees. But when it starts getting really cold, I have a problem with it. And I'm tired of driving in snow and ice. Maybe that's my age. I've lived here my whole life. Maybe I need to move south somewhere and get away from all this. My wife wants to move to Alaska. And I'm like, no, can do. I'm not going to live in Alaska. There's polar bears up there. They'll eat you. So, welcome to the show, folks. I hope weather on your end of the stick is doing just fine. And we've been talking about this topic, and I tend to jump right into it. When I do the Situation Room with Rocky, we play off of each other, so we have lots of topics, and we jump all over the place, and we do a little bit of what we have dubbed over the years ADHD radio, meaning we just talk about what's there. We have general topics that we want to hit, And if you want to hear us, you can join us tonight at 11 p.m. Central, midnight Eastern, which would be the Thursday show because it's midnight out east, midnight Thursday. And we jump all over the place. It's a mode of doing radio that is very conversational. You ever sat out with your friends for a beer or a cup of coffee or whatever you're doing together, and you're talking, and the topics can jump from one to another? That's what's great about conversation. When you're sitting here all alone, just staring at the camera, staring at any notes I may have taken, have things I want to talk about, I tend to be a not notes person. I have things in notes that I refer to when I'm talking about heavy academic stuff or things like that, and I have to refer to them sometimes. And sometimes I get lost in my notes because I like to do the ADHD thing. I like to rabbit trail a little bit and talk about all different kinds of things, so it remains interesting to you. I appreciate everybody who says they love this topic and that we're sticking to this topic for a little while and going through these things, but I also want it to be fun for you to listen to. I don't want your eyes to gloss over too quickly and too easily. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of what we do. Thanks for giving me your time. It means a lot to me. So we've been talking about this Gnosticism thing, this Jesus mysteries thing. And the interesting thing about all this to me is that it starts to give us a little different picture of what we believe in very literalist historical Christian tradition. Now, there are some of you out there, I'm sure, no doubt, that you get your sensibilities a little in a bundle about this because, as I did, rightfully so, in my younger days, because it presents a bit of a challenge to what I believe. And when you challenge people's belief systems on a faith level, you're going to start tearing at what they have used as this fabric, this tightly knit fabric of their life, and the things that they've believed their whole lives. And when you start doing that, to yourself, sometimes you'll end up like I was when I was writing my books, the Nephilim and the Reptilians, and I was digging into religious history and trying to decipher certain things. What was encoded in the Bible was the story of Adam and Eve, as we talked about fairly recently when we were talking about Cain and the other people, but was the Genesis story, creation story. Was this an encoded message? And because it reads like mythology, it reads just like the mythology of the ancient Sumerians, the ancient Mesopotamians. It reads like the mythology of the ancient Greeks. Take, for instance, consider this, and I know we've mentioned this before, but in context, look at the gods of Olympus in the Greek myths and how people had their lives a bit tampered with by the gods. And the gods would all meet in the courts of Olympus, and they'd be doing their thing, sitting by fountains, eating grapes, drinking wine, playing games, board games up in the echelons of Mount Olympus, and they would play with people's lives. Now, how does that look any different than, other than if you take the faith element out of it, how would that look any different than, say, the story of Job in the Old Testament, the earliest chronological book written in the Old Testament, where the Satan enters the courts of heaven and he challenges God about the life of Job. And he says, Job, yeah, he worships you, but he's got everything. He says, take everything away from him, and I'll bet you he won't worship you anymore. And God says, I'll take that bet. And so he allows a whirlwind to kill all of Job's children. Was it 9 of his children? His sons and daughters? All killed in one fell swoop in a whirlwind. They were all gathered in a house having a dinner party of some kind. Then he allows all of Job's crops and his herds to be destroyed by fire. He allows everything to be taken away from Job except his very life, because that was the bargain he made with the Satan in that passage was, you can touch him in any way you want except his person. You will not take his life. And he says, I'll bet you he will still worship me. And the Satan was saying, I'll bet you he won't. And so there was this, it's like this divine gambling game using the human being as their pawn. Now, was this to maybe prove a greater theological point? Sure. But stop there for a second and look at the actions that took place. Does that read like, would you consider the gods of Olympus to be mythology? Especially when they played with the lives of people? Yeah, we do. But we don't consider that when we attach a faith to it, as in the case of Job. Well, that's within my biblical faith. And so if you step outside the faith box for a minute, and remember, faith is what you bring to the table. It's not what is given to you by the story. So you bring to the table, I believe this. So when you exit that for a few minutes, it all looks like mythology. Same with the creation story. So these are the questions that started me asking. These are what I want you to ask. And if God is who we were taught in church, we're in big trouble with God for even asking the question. But then you have Jesus, who said to his own disciples, he says, let the little kids come to me. Let them ask their questions. What was it? When you have faith in God, you must have faith as that of a little child, Jesus said. And you know what? I have 6 children. I have one that's still 4 years old, all ranging all the way up to twin daughters who are 27. There's not a single one of those kids that didn't come with a million questions. So if we're to look at God and consider God the Father, or as in the New Testament it says, the Abba Father, the daddy, so to speak, the loving daddy, he's not going to turn away our questions. We're going to have questions and we're going to be allowed to ask them. So when you have a faith in God, you're supposed to be able to ground that faith in your questions, not turn away the questions. So I've heard that interpreted, by the way, in the church, in theological circles, when Jesus said, when you come to me, you must have the faith of a little child, meaning you wipe out everything else. You have total faith and trust in God and no questions asked because you're like a little child. You're focused on the parent. I see that verse as meaning more, if you exegete it out and if you look into the language, this means come bearing your questions. This is what a little child does. And so here's the big question for you. If you were presented material that said the historical Jesus, as we have understood him through the church, can be challenged by earlier information that sheds him in a little different historical light, therefore changing a little bit, maybe a lot of bit, of what the church made him out to be, would you not and should you not, as a person of faith, be interested in knowing what those things say? The Gnostic writings about Jesus and about previous Messiah figures, or at least 12 to 15 of them out there prior to the time of Jesus, that were messianic figures that all had very similar features to their lives and their biographies, as did Jesus. And we went through that at in the first session we did on this. Born on December 25th, which is a manufactured date. It's the date that was ascribed to the Bacchus deity, the Osiris Dionysus. Dionysus just being another name for Bacchus, Roman versus Greek. And so if you have things like the date of birth, the shepherds being there, walking on the waters, calming the storm, healing the sick, raising the dead, crucified, descends into hell for 3 days, resurrects. These are all features of these previous messiahs as well, that have been also attributed to Jesus Christ by his followers who wrote about him. And then as the church grew, and by the mid-4th century, in the mid-300s, it turned into the universal church, the Roman Catholic Church. You have established these facts as a literal history of Jesus. This is all we've talked about up to this point, is establishing these things. But then the Gnostics were closed out at the time. They were terrorized by the church. They were tortured and they were wiped out, where pagan religion, if you will, became non-existent. And we only found it and rediscovered it in their writings when at Nag Hammadi, when the writings of the Gnostics were uncovered. And we found them. We go back and we dig into these. These were like the Dead Sea Scrolls, only for the Gnostics. And they date back to the time period, 2,000 years back. So what do you do as a person of faith who believes in the literal story of Jesus, and then you find out, wait, there's another version of this out there that's not the literalist view? Wouldn't it be incumbent upon you to study that, to ask the questions, to think through it, rather than just dismiss it because it doesn't abide with your faith? Oh, that's not what we were taught in Sunday school. That's not what they taught me in seminary. That's not what we learned in church. That's not what they've been saying for hundreds of years. Well, no, it isn't. But what happens when you discover that? Is not God, very God, capable of maintaining the integrity of His Word and of His story and of His historical Jesus? If it were true, and God is who He says He is, why can't He maintain that? Why is there such a struggle, such a contradiction, such a struggle within the mind when you find out these things? Which one's true? Are either of them true? Are they all true? Do they all point to a singular message? There's a struggle over it. There's a controversy over it. And so why does that exist? If God is who He says He is, and if faith in Jesus Christ is so eternally important, salvific faith, the faith that will save you, that will prevent you from going to hell for all eternity and going to heaven for all eternity, why is that left up to the finite mind of man to work through the struggle? If God really loves us, as the Bible says He does, why is it not also provided in those scriptures proof beyond a shadow of a doubt? It's not. It's up to your faith. So if it's so important for eternal, infinite, non-ending destiny after this life, why is it left up to us just kind of figuring it out by faith? Oh, and if you didn't figure it out, thank you for playing. So this is the thing. This is why I look into this stuff. And there's the sacred spectacle at Eleusis that I want to look into here. I want to start with this, leaving off where we left off last night. And I've spent so much time. I got about 5 minutes before the break, and then we'll pick up where we leave off, of course, after the break. But what were these ancient mysteries that could inspire such relevant awe, this heartfelt appreciation? We went through that whole list of things that pagan religion brought to humanity. The mystery religion was practiced for thousands of years. And during that time, it spread throughout the entire ancient world. It took on many different forms. Some were frenzied. Others were meditative. Meditative. That's like the word contemplative. They were meditative. Some involved bloody animal sacrifice, while others were presided over by strict vegetarians. And at certain moments in history, the mysteries were opened up to humanity. And they were endorsed or at least tolerated by the state. And at other times, they were small scale. They were secretive affairs. They were in robes in the woods around campfires. Well, campfires makes it sound kind of Boy Scoutish. Around pyres in the woods, let's put it that way. And central to all of these forms of the mysteries, however, was this myth of a dying and resurrecting God-man. Now that is what Jesus is. We were taught that he was the God-man. He is God, very God, taking the form of a man. The kenosis, like we have gnosis, which is knowledge, the gaining of knowledge, the mysteries. The kenosis was the emptying of all knowledge, the emptying of everything. And when God came in the form of a baby in the womb of Mary, the Virgin, Mary, the mother of Jesus, that he emptied himself of all that he was. There's even an old hymn that just popped into mind that says he emptied himself of all but love, as the hymn says. Well, it says that God emptied himself of the Godhead, of the Godness, to become the baby, and that he grew into the Savior. So all these ancient mysteries had in common the God-man who would die and resurrect for the good of humanity. And the Greek mysteries celebrated Eleusis in honor of the great mother goddess, and the God-man Dionysus were the most famous of all the mystery cults. The sanctuary of Eleusis was finally I'm going to spell that for you so you can get it. Eleusis, Eleusis, was finally destroyed by bands of fanatical Christian monks in 396 AD, CE, Common Era, if you will. Fanatical Christian monks destroyed it. But up until this tragic act of vandalism, the mysteries had been celebrated there for over 11 centuries, 1100 years, and wiped out in the late 4th century, 396. At the height of their popularity, people were coming from all over the known world to be initiated. Men and women, rich and poor, slaves and emperors, and even a Brahmin priest from India. And so each year, and by the way, I have footnotes I could give you on all this stuff. We're just hitting it superficially here to give the information. We can certainly get into this a lot deeper. And I don't want this to become like an academic lesson where it's, all right, pull out your syllabus. We ended on page 47 yesterday. We're going to pick up there and take notes now because there will be a test on Friday. I don't want it to be that. I want to give you kind of the lighter version. If you want to know any of this stuff, write me or just tell me in the chat room. We can dig even deeper and get a little headier. But suffice it to say, I could give you all the background information for all this. When I say there was even a Brahmin priest from India, there is information on him. So each year, some 30,000 Athenian citizens embarked on a 30-kilometer barefoot pilgrimage to the sacred site of Eleusis. And it was on the coast, and they were celebrating the mysteries of Dionysus. Somebody asked, I think it was Gemma in the chat room last night, asked his Bacchus, when we were talking about the Orpheus Baccha deity on the amulet. She said, Bacchus, is that the same as the god of wine? Yeah, Bacchus, Dionysus were the same god, but he was more than the god of wine. He represented many other things, just like some of the Egyptian gods, like Hathor, the calf goddess. She was the goddess of fertility, but she was also the god to the miners, the patron goddess of the miners. She was the god of happiness. She was the god of fertility. And so the same with Bacchus, Dionysus. So for days, these pilgrims would have been preparing for this important religious event by fasting, offering sacrifices, undergoing the ritual purifications that are attached to such things. And as those about to be initiated danced along the sacred way to Eleusis, accompanied by the frenzied beat of cymbals and tambourines, they were accosted by masked men who abused and insulted them, and while others beat them with sticks. And at the head of the procession was carried the statue of Dionysus himself, leading them ever onwards. And by the way, this is all staged. This is all events to challenge the pilgrims. Could you imagine dancing all the way on a foot trip to somewhere out on the coast? So this is what they did. And after the ritual naked bathing in the sea, when they finally reached the coast, and other purification ceremonies, the crowd reached the great doors of the of the Telesterion. Okay, they reached the doors of the Telesterion, a huge, purpose-built initiation hall, and only the chosen few who were already initiated or about to be initiated into the secret mysteries could enter. And you know what? I just noticed. We're at the end of this segment, and I've gone a slightly overtime. So you sit there for 2 minutes. We're going to pick up right where we left off. Be right back. Sit tight. All right, folks, welcome back from that break. Sorry we went a little over time at the beginning and had to cut off very abruptly, but let's pick it up where we left off. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can watch the simulcast, join in the live chat with other listeners to the show over at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And I want to give a quick shout out to my friend and a sponsor of this show, Penman Hats. You can see I'm not wearing my hat today because I actually combed my hair this morning. But these fine Penman hats, go take a look at his website, penmanhats.com, for the finest in bespoke custom hats. And guys, you need a good lid. He's got all different styles over there. Take a look. Women, they're for you too. So go take a peek, see what you think. Pick yourself up a Penman hat. All right, folks, let's jump right back into this. So we were talking about this ceremony, that these pilgrims, they would go out to the coast and they would join in these ceremonies. And the question was, while they were initiating themselves into the secret mysteries, what awesome ceremony was held behind those closed doors that touched great philosophers, artists, statesmen, scientists of the ancient world so deeply? This was pan-cultural, it seemed, that all these people were touched by the ancient mystery religions. And all initiates were sworn to secrecy, and they held the mysteries so sacred that they kept this oath. And so from large numbers of hints and clues, we know that they witnessed a sublime theatrical spectacle. They were awed by the sounds, dazzled by the lights. They were bathed in the blaze of a huge fire, and they trembled to the nerve-shattering reverberations of a mighty gong. The Hierophant, the great high priest of the mysteries, was quite literally the greatest showman. He was Hugh Jackman. He orchestrated this terrifyingly transformative, dramatic reenactment of the sacred myth. He himself was dressed as the central character, the god-man Dionysus. Now, there's a modern scholar who writes this about it. Let me read this directly. He says, "A mystery religion was thus a divine drama which portrayed before the wandering eyes of the privileged observers the story of the struggles, sufferings, and victory of a patron deity. The travail of nature in which life ultimately triumphs over death, and joy is born of pain. The whole ritual of the mysteries aimed especially at quickening the emotional life. No means of exciting the emotions was so neglected in the passion play, either by way of inducing careful predispositions or of supplying external stimulus. Tense mental anticipations, heightened by a period of abstinence, hushed silences, imposing processions, and elaborate pageantry, music loud and violent or soft and enthralling, delirious dances, the drinking of spirituous liquors." This is where the whole Bacchus and the wine thing comes in. The drinking of spirituous liquors, physical macerations. Macerations? I don't use that word very often. Macerations. Somebody look that up and put that in the chat room. A definition. Macerations. M-A-C, Mac. E-R-A-T-I-O-N-S. Macerations. Alternations of dense darkness and dazzling light, the sight of gorgeous ceremonial vestments, the handling of holy emblems, auto-suggestion and the promptings of the Hierophant, these and many secrets of emotional exaltation were in vogue. Now let me ask you, when you look at the liturgy, say, of the very Orthodox Roman Catholic Church, you look at the vestments, you look at the statuary. Now, it's not a wild party. You don't have a lot of wild, bedazzling music. But I remember as a child, when I was, my stepfather was Ukrainian, and he had us baptized when I was 5 into the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and which is Eastern Orthodox, basically. Not Roman Catholicism, just slightly different page. And I remember as a 5-year-old boy carrying a little silver box of some kind, and I don't remember what was in it, why I was carrying it. I don't remember the ceremony, but I remember being in a suit and tie at age 5. My stepdad walking us down, and the sanctuary in the church was dark. There were all kinds of candles lit. It was in the evening, and I'm walking, and I'm holding this box. It had something to do with my baptism, or being brought into that faith. And I remember looking around, and I was bedazzled in the quiet darkness of the candles flickering off all the gold vestments and statues and prosceniums and iconography and all of this. And I remember just soaking that in. And that still is a comfortable image in my head at times. When I think back to that and I go, oh, when I was a kid, that really enthralled me in a quiet way. It was very moving. So imagine that you have this Hierophant. You might recognize the word Hierophant from the tarot decks, as the high priest, kind of like the high priest. He's the one who is the learned man, the one who has the sacred knowledge, the sacred training, and he's the one who leads you in worship, leads you in good counsel, and so on. Opens up the esoteric to those of you who have only experienced the exoteric. He's opened it to the esoteric, the inner from the outward draw. So this dramatization of the myth of Dionysus is the origin of theater. But the initiates were not a passive audience. They were participants who shared in the passion of the God-man, whose death and rebirth symbolically represented the death and spiritual rebirth of each one of them. As a modern authority explains, and by the way, again, I have footnotes on these guys. I just don't have them written in here. I've got a marked footnote. Dionysus was the god of the most blessed ecstasy and the most enraptured love. But he was also the persecuted god, the suffering and dying God, and all whom he loved, all who attended him, had to share his tragic fate. Now, I'm just going to look at this footnote. This was, just so you know who said this, this was W.F. Otto in 1965. Macchioro, Vidi Macchioro in 1930. The two traditions as to who introduced the death of Dionysus into the mysteries are noted. One says Orpheus himself. Another that the Orphic poet Onomacritus made the innovation of in the 6th century BC. And Clement of Alexandria confirms that the symbols revealed in the mysteries refer to the death of Dionysus. So there's the footnote on that one. Just to let you know, we've got these things documented, pretty well documented. So by witnessing this awesome tragedy of Dionysus, the initiates at Eleusis shared in his suffering. Does this all sound a little bit familiar? They shared in his suffering. They shared in his death. They shared in his resurrection. And by doing so, they experienced this spiritual purification known as catharsis. And the mysteries didn't offer religious dogmas to simply be believed. Like, I'm telling you what is said. Turn in your Bibles to Leviticus chapter so-and-so, verse so-and-so, and today we're going to talk about this, and you need to apply this to your life, and you need to believe this because God said it and put it in His Word. Amen. It wasn't that. This was something that was not presented as dogma that you had to believe, but as a myth to be entered into. You put yourself into it. And by the way, I think this is a good place to maybe make a note. I am not an initiate in these things. I'm not pushing a religion on you. I am talking about these things that are, what would you say? They contradict what we're taught in church. And I'm looking into this. I'm questioning. I'm asking the questions. I did many years ago. I am again now. Because I want to know more information about this. So I'm not somebody that's pushing a religion on you of a new type. What I'm telling you is that what we think we believe is predated by something different. And I want you to see those similarities. The similarities in the literal historical Jesus from the church pretty much match those of what was going on with the pagan religions, the mystery religions. They didn't just share bullet-pointed match points. They shared philosophies. They're slightly different. Plutarch, a pagan high priest, confesses that those who'd been initiated could produce no proof of the beliefs that they acquired. There's no proof. The initiates couldn't prove it. Tell me a Christian who exists today, who believes in Jesus, is born again, all of those things, who can prove that exists outside of a faith element. They can't. And I'm not saying that's a detriment. I'm just saying there's no way to prove it. It's by faith. It's all important for all eternity, but there's no way to prove it. And the same thing, Plutarch said that nobody could give you proof that the beliefs that they acquired had any proof to them. Aristotle himself maintained it's not necessary for the initiated to learn anything, but to receive impressions and to be put to a certain frame of mind. The philosopher Proclus talks of the mysteries as evoking a sympathy of the soul with the ritual in a way that's unintelligible to us, yet divine. So that some of the initiates are stricken with panic, being filled with divine awe. Others assimilated themselves to the holy symbols. They leave their own identity. They become at home with the gods. They experience divine possession. Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, teaches that we are totally separate from the divine. There is no divinity in us. That we are, as John Wycliffe preached a couple of centuries ago, we are sinners in the hands of an angry God. Yet the mysteries taught you that you were part of deity. Now, is this just the words that, as the Apostle Paul, the usurper of Christianity, wrote in the New Testament, these are words to tickle our ears, to pull us away from the truth, deceptions of Satan, or is there something real to this? Why did the myth enacted by the mysteries have such a profound effect on people? And so much so, is it because, is religion, is faith supposed to be something that makes us hurt, that we agonize over, that we struggle to attain? Or that we put our faith in somebody else doing for us? As Rocky and I talked about on the Situation Room the other day, if salvation, Christianity speaking, within Christianity, if salvation or pleasing to God to get to heaven, let's put it like getting to heaven, if that was something we could earn by our own good deeds, why did Jesus have to die on the cross as a sacrifice? If we could earn it ourselves, why did he have to die? Why did he have to provide that way for us if we could do good things to attain it? That always baffled me. But remember, in the Baptist church where I grew up and I learned all my stuff, theologically, it was not our good works that did it. We actually taught, the Bible taught you, there's nothing good that you can do to attain God's favor or to attain heaven. He sees you through the filter of the Son, the one who became the perfect sacrifice, the perfect blood sacrifice, the perfect remission, atonement for sins, propitiation for sins. It was all filtered through Jesus Christ. Therefore, your coming to God had to be through Christ alone. I believed that for many years, and there might be many of you who believe that now. But the basic foundational teaching was that we had a sin nature, and there's nothing good we could do to get to God. It had to be accomplished through Jesus. The mysteries were telling us that we were already divine. And this was prior to the followers of Jesus, a few centuries after his death, morphing him into one of these similar pre-messiahs and making a whole new religion out of it. So there were encoded secret teachings that were involved in these mysteries. And in antiquity, the word mythos did not mean something untrue, which today we have. I've got it in the title of one of my books, The Secret History of the Reptilians. It's subtitled The Pervasive Presence of the Serpent in Human History, Religion, and Alien Mythos. Mythos now presents kind of an untrue picture. It's a mythology. It's the mythos. It's the mystery around a topic. But it didn't mean untrue back then as it does for us today. Superficially, a myth was this entertaining story. But to the initiated, it was sacred code. It contained profound spiritual teachings. Plato commented, and this is a quote from Plato. Now, of course, we have heard many times that there were no works of Plato that ever existed past his death. That he was quoted by other writers of his day as having said such and so. So this is attributed to Plato. It looks as if those also who established rites of initiation for us were no fools, but that there is a hidden meaning in their teachings. And if I look at the footnote I've got on, this is Plato in Phaedo of 69 of the Common Era, or BC, I'm sorry. He explains that it's those who have given their lives to true philosophy who will grasp the hidden meaning encoded in the mystery myths, and so become completely identified with the God-man in an experience of mystical enlightenment. So now, what I'm finding in all of this, in Christianity, literal Christianity, the pagan mysteries, everything takes you pouring yourself into it, taking it on. It's not just superficial. I think I'll give this a try over here. It's like we used to say, you can't just try God, you can't try salvation, you can't try Jesus. Same with the mysteries. You can't really try it. You have to sink in before you can absorb what it really means and what it really is. In my faith as a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, I was thoroughly immersed. I had totally given myself over to it. And so it had great reality for me because it became part psychologically of who I was. Some would say, well, that's the Holy Spirit working in you, Scotty. Well, you can't prove that. That's the problem. Same thing with the mysteries. You can't prove any of this. It's what you give yourself to is what you become. So the gaining of enlightenment was something that you gained because you gave yourself to it. And so the ancient philosophers, they weren't so foolish as to believe that the mystery myths were literally true. But they were wise enough to recognize that they were an easy introduction to the profound mystical philosophy at the heart of the mysteries. Celestius writes, "To wish to teach all men the truth of the gods causes the foolish to despise, because they cannot learn, and the good to be slothful, whereas to conceal the truth by myths prevents the former from despising philosophy and compels the latter to study it." That's an interesting quote. It was the role of the priests and the philosophers in the mysteries to decode the hidden depths of spiritual meaning contained within the mystery myths. Heliodorus, a priest of the mysteries, explains, "Philosophers and theologians do not disclose the meanings embedded in these stories to laymen, but simply give them preliminary instructions in the form of a myth. But those who have reached the higher grades of the mysteries, they initiate into the clear knowledge in the privacy of the holy shrine, in the light cast by the burning torch of truth." Now, isn't this what we do in Christianity and Judaism and Christianity too? We have to have teachers, those that initiate us into the deeper things. So while I'm making comparisons, they all really take on the same general practice. You have to believe, you have to indoctrinate yourself. You have to program yourself to believe. You have to immerse yourself in it for those things to work for you. The mysteries were divided into various levels of initiation. They led to an initiate step by step, taken through deepening levels of understanding. The number of levels of initiation varied in different mystery traditions, but essentially, the initiate was led from the outer mysteries, that exoteric stuff that kind of looked interesting and drew your attention, in which the myths were understood superficially as religious stories, to the inner mysteries where they were drawn, the esoteric, in which the myths were revealed as spiritual allegories. All this stuff on the outside. You see where we're going with this? The saviors, the death, the burial, the resurrections of all these messiahs, just as embodied in what they made Christ become, are all simply spiritual allegory that leads you to understanding deeper mystery. And when first the initiate was ritually purified, then they were taught the secret teachings on a one-to-one basis. The highest stage was when the initiate understood the true meaning of the teachings and finally experienced the Theon of Smyrna, what the Theon of Smyrna calls friendship and interior communion with God. Now, isn't this what we're all supposed to experience in our religions? This communication, communion with God, becoming one with God. God fills us with His Spirit. We're born again in evangelical Christianity, and we become one with God. And it's something that you could never lose. Salvation, you could turn your back on God, but because at one point in your life you accepted God as your Savior, Jesus as your Savior, you are forever saved, because this is what Jesus did for you. And the whole idea with that was, if I could do nothing to earn my salvation, I certainly can do nothing to throw it away. Once saved, always saved is the idea. So even in my own circles, even though I've turned my back on most of that faith, I would have those within that say, you're backslidden, but you're still saved, you're still born again. That was the philosophy. So the whole point of everything is this friendship and interior communion with God. This is what the mysteries said as well, but they said that's only attainable when you realize that the externals, the histories, the pictures, the messiahs, are all just things that were made to draw your attention into the deeper things. And that these were all just allegories, spiritual allegories. So this folds over into the international mysteries. The mysteries dominated the pagan world at the time. No other deity is represented on the monuments of ancient Greece and Italy as much as Dionysus, the god-man of the Eleusinian mysteries. He's a deity with many names. He had Aeacus, Basarius, Bromius, Euus, Euas, Sabasius, Zagreus, Ionius, Linnaeus, some of these words, the Eleutherius, and so the list goes on and on and on. But these are just some of his Greek names. The God-man is an omnipotent mythic figure throughout the entire ancient Mediterranean, known in different ways by many cultures. 5 centuries before the birth of Christ, the Greek historian Herodotus, who we've quoted many times, he was a historian. He was a 4th century BCE historian. He's the one, and I've quoted him many times, who wrote about Cambyses and the disappearance of the 50,000-strong army of Cambyses in a sandstorm, as they went and sacked Egypt and went and moved to sack the oracle at Siwa out in the desert. And they just disappeared off the face of the earth. It's one of the great historical mysteries. But Herodotus, known as the father of history, discovered this when he traveled to Egypt. On the shores of a sacred lake in the Nile Delta, he witnessed an enormous festival. It was held every year, in which the Egyptians performed a dramatic spectacle before tens of thousands of men and women, he reported, representing the death and the resurrection of Osiris. Herodotus was this initiate into the Greek mysteries, and he recognized that what he calls the Passion of Osiris was the very same drama that initiates saw enacted before them at Eleusis as the Passion of Dionysus. The Egyptian myth of Osiris is the primal myth of the ancient mystery god-man. It reaches back into prehistory. And it can be found, the story's so ancient, it can be found in pyramid texts written over 4,500 years ago. So, folks, I hate to say it, I've brought us right up to the brink of being done again. And we've got to wrap this up very quickly or I'll go over time. We're going to pick this right up here tomorrow, talking about Herodotus. And I want to thank you for being here. I want you to think about these things. Think about it. Realize that you have the access internally to acquire the mysteries. And we'll talk more about this next time. Stay tuned. We'll be back in 23 hours.